Elena Marchetti's shoes hit the wet pavement hard as she ran between two rows of shipping containers, her breath coming in short, painful bursts. She had no idea where she was. 10 minutes ago, she had taken a shortcut through the old Docklands to save time after her shift at the hospital, and now 3 men in dark jackets were walking fast behind her, calling out for her to stop. She turned a corner and slammed straight into a wall of solid muscle wrapped in a tailored coat. Strong hands caught her by the shoulders before she could fall. She looked up, ready to scream, and found herself staring into a pair of calm, dark eyes that did not match the chaos around them. The man was tall, composed, and utterly still, as if the shouting men behind her were nothing more than background noise to him. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. Elena did not understand why she obeyed him. Maybe it was the steadiness in his voice. Maybe it was simple survival instinct. Whatever the reason, she stepped back and let this stranger place himself between her and the men who had been chasing her. The 3 men slowed the moment they saw who was standing in front of them. Their expressions changed instantly, from aggressive confidence to visible unease. "Mr. Reyes," one of them said, his voice suddenly careful. "We didn't know she was with you." "She isn't," Damian Reyes replied, his tone flat and final. "But she is now under my protection for the next 5 minutes, which should be enough time for you to remember that this block belongs to me, and no one enters it without my permission." The men exchanged a look, muttered an apology, and disappeared back the way they had come, their footsteps fading quickly into the dark maze of containers. Elena's heart was still pounding. She studied the man in front of her, trying to understand what had just happened. He wore an expensive coat, but there was nothing soft about him. His jaw was set, his shoulders squared, and there was an authority in the way he carried himself that made her instinctively lower her voice when she finally spoke. "Thank you," she managed. "I don't even know what just happened. I was just trying to get home. This isn't a place people walk through at night," Damian said, studying her with an intensity that made her feel like he was reading every detail of her life in a single glance. "Not unless they know exactly whose streets they're on." "I didn't know these streets belonged to anyone," Elena admitted, still trying to catch her breath. "I'm sorry. I'll find another way home." "Where do you live?" The question came out simple, but there was something underneath it, a kind of quiet command that expected an answer. Elena hesitated, unsure whether giving her address to a total stranger in a dark dockyard was wise, but something about the way he had stopped those men made her feel oddly safe standing near him. "Near the old clock tower," she said finally. "About 20 minutes from here." Damian nodded once, as if filing the information away permanently. "I'll have someone walk you." "That's really not necessary," Elena said quickly. "I can manage." "You already proved you can't," he said, though there was no cruelty in his voice, only a plain observation. "Not through here anyway." Elena opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. He was right, and arguing with a man who had just made 3 grown men apologize and vanish within seconds did not seem like the smartest choice she had made that night. A younger man appeared out of the shadows almost instantly, as though he had been waiting for a signal only he could hear. Damian said a few quiet words to him, and the man nodded and gestured for Elena to follow. Before she left, Elena turned back one more time. "Can I at least know the name of the man who saved me tonight?" "You already have it," Damian said. "Reyes." "Just Reyes?" For the first time, something shifted in his expression, something that was almost a smile but not quite. "For now, that's all you need." Elena walked away with her guide, glancing back once to see Damian still standing exactly where she had left him, watching her go with an expression she could not read. She told herself the strange flutter in her chest was simply leftover fear from being chased. She told herself she would never see this mysterious Reyes again, and that this strange night would fade into nothing more than an odd story she might tell a friend one day. She was wrong on both counts. 2 days later, Elena was working a late shift at the hospital when a delivery arrived for her at the front desk. No name on the card, only a short line of text. "Glad you made it home safely." She stood there holding the small bouquet of flowers, completely unsure how anyone could have known where she worked, let alone tracked her down to send something so simple and unexpected. She asked the delivery driver who had sent it. He shrugged and said he was only told an address, nothing more. Elena carried the flowers back to the nurse's station, her mind spinning with questions she could not answer. That night, walking home, She noticed a car parked near the corner of her street, engine idling, lights off. She slowed her pace, unsure whether to feel afraid or curious. The passenger window rolled down, and there he was again, sitting in the back seat, looking as composed as he had the first time she saw him. "You've been following me," Elena said, more surprised than angry. "I've been making sure you get home," Damien corrected her. "There's a difference." "Is there?" He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing how honest he wanted to be. "Not really," he admitted, "but it sounds better." Despite herself, Elena laughed, a short surprise sound that seemed to catch them both off guard. It was the first time she had laughed since that frightening night in the Docklands, and something about doing it in front of this strange, powerful man felt oddly freeing. "Who are you, really?" she asked. "People don't apologize to strangers and vanish just because someone says a last name. People do exactly that when the name carries enough weight," Damien said simply. "And your name carries a lot of weight." "More than I'd like, most days." Elena crossed her arms, studying him through the open car window. "You're not going to tell me what you do, are you?" "Not tonight," he said. "Maybe not for a while." "Then why keep showing up?" For a moment, Damien did not answer. He looked at her, the way a man looks at something he has not allowed himself to want in a very long time, something dangerous and unfamiliar that he is not entirely sure how to handle. "Because for reasons I don't fully understand," he said finally, "I find myself unable to walk away." Elena felt her breath catch. She did not know this man. She did not know his world, his work, or why grown men flinched at the mention of his name. But standing there under the dim streetlight, she realized she did not want him to walk away either. "There are rules I've kept for a very long time," Damien continued, his voice quieter now, almost like he was speaking more to himself than to her. "Rules that have kept me alive. Rules that say a man in my position does not allow himself distractions, does not allow himself attachments, does not allow himself to care about anyone outside the small circle of people he already trusts with his life." "And?" Elena asked softly. "And 2 nights ago, I broke every one of them the moment I saw you running through my streets." The words hung in the cold night air between them. Elena had no experience with a world like his, no idea what kind of danger might come from being noticed by a man with that much power and that much caution. But there was something honest in the way he admitted it, something that made her feel like she was seeing a side of him almost no one else was allowed to witness. "I don't even know your first name," she said quietly. "Damien," he said. "Damien Reyes." "Elena," she replied. "Elena Marchetti." He repeated her name once, slowly, as if testing the shape of it, as if deciding whether it belonged somewhere important in his memory. "Elena," he said again. "I intend to remember that." She should have walked away. Every instinct that had kept her safe her whole life told her to thank him politely, close the distance between them, and never look back toward that dark car again. Instead, she found herself leaning slightly closer, drawn by a pull she could not explain, and did not particularly want to fight. "So what happens now?" she asked. Damien's expression grew serious again, the weight of his world settling back over his features like a shadow returning to its place. "Now," he said, "you go inside, lock your door, and try to forget the license plate of this car." "That's not what I meant." "I know," he said, "but it's the only answer I can give you tonight that won't put you in danger." He signaled to the driver, and the car began to pull away slowly. Elena stood on the sidewalk, watching the taillights fade into the dark, her mind racing with questions that had no easy answers. She did not know it yet, but the rule Damien Reyes had broken the moment he met her would change the course of both their lives forever, pulling her into a world of danger, loyalty, and power she had never imagined existing so close to her own quiet life. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment that night, Elena could not shake the feeling that whatever had just started between them was only the beginning of something far bigger than either of them could control. Inside her small apartment, she set the flowers on the kitchen table and sat down without turning on the lights, letting the streetlight outside cast long shadows across the room. She thought about the calm way Damien had spoken, the careful control in every word, and the strange gentleness hidden underneath a manner that clearly commanded fear from everyone else around him. It did not make sense. Men who could make three grown strangers apologize and disappear within seconds were not supposed to speak so softly, or admit so plainly, that they were struggling against their own rules. She told herself she would not think about him again. She told herself that whatever world he belonged to was not a world meant for a hospital nurse who spent her days caring for strangers and her nights trying to save enough money to finish her degree. She told herself all of this, and none of it stopped her from glancing out her window one more time before she finally went to bed, half hoping to see his car still parked somewhere on the street below. It wasn't there, but 3 days later, another delivery arrived, this time without flowers, only a small folded note left at the hospital's front desk, with her name written in neat, careful handwriting. It read simply, "Some rules are worth breaking. I intend to find out if this is one of them." There was no signature, but Elena did not need one. She already knew exactly who had sent it, and despite every warning bell ringing quietly in the back of her mind, she found herself smiling as she tucked the note into her pocket, unable to stop wondering when she might see him again. She did not have to wait long to find out, and when their paths crossed again, neither of them would be able to pretend this was simply a coincidence anymore. A week passed before Elena saw Damien again, and when she did, it happened in a way she never expected. She was leaving the hospital after a long overnight shift, exhausted and half asleep on her feet, when she noticed a familiar black car parked near the entrance, engine running, headlights off. She hesitated only a moment before walking toward it, telling herself she was simply curious, though some part of her already knew that curiosity was not the whole truth anymore. The back door opened before she reached it. Damien sat inside, dressed less formally than before, his jacket unbuttoned, his tie loosened around his collar, as though he had come straight from somewhere that had demanded far more of him than a simple morning meeting. "You look tired," Elena said, sliding into the seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. "I could say the same about you," Damien replied, studying the dark circles under her eyes with an expression that carried more concern than she expected from a man in his position. "Long shift?" 14 hours, she said, leaning her head back against the seat. "One of the nurses called in sick, and the hospital was short-staffed. It happens more than you'd think." "You work too hard for how little you're paid," Damien said. It was not a question. "How would you know how little I'm paid?" He didn't answer right away, and something in his silence told her everything she needed to know. He had looked into her. He knew things about her life that she had never volunteered, details that should have felt invasive but somehow, coming from him, only felt like proof of how seriously he was taking whatever this was between them. "You had someone check on me," Elena said slowly. "I had someone make sure you were safe," Damien corrected. "There's a difference between watching someone and protecting them, even if the actions look similar from the outside." "That's a very convenient distinction." "Maybe," he admitted, "but it's the truth." Elena studied him for a long moment, trying to decide how she felt about a man who clearly had the resources and the will to learn everything about her life without her ever knowing. Most people would have found it alarming. Elena found herself oddly comforted by it instead, as though someone finally cared enough to notice the small, exhausting details of a life that often felt invisible to everyone around her. "Where are we going?" she asked, noticing the car had begun moving. "Nowhere important," Damien said. "I only wanted a few minutes before you disappeared into your apartment and slept the day away. There's a small cafe near the river that opens early. I thought you might want breakfast before you collapse." "You're inviting me to breakfast." "I am." After showing up outside my hospital unannounced in the middle of the night. "It was 6 in the morning, Damien said, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Hardly the middle of the night." Elena laughed despite herself, surprised again by how easily he could pull that reaction out of her, even when every rational part of her mind was warning her to be cautious. "Fine," she said. "Breakfast. But you're going to actually answer some questions this time." "I'll answer what I can." The cafe was small and mostly empty at that hour, tucked along a quiet stretch of the river where the morning light spread gold across the water. They sat near the window, and for the first time, Elena saw Damien in ordinary daylight, without the shadows of the docklands or the tinted windows of his car hiding the details of his face. He looked younger somehow, less like the powerful stranger who had frightened 3 men into silence, and more like someone who simply hadn't slept enough, someone carrying more weight than his shoulders were built to hold. "Tell me something true," Elena said, wrapping her hands around a warm cup of coffee. Not something dangerous, just something true about you that has nothing to do with whatever business keeps you up at night. Damien considered the request seriously, as if it were far harder to answer than she intended it to be. My mother used to make this same coffee, he said finally. Different beans, probably. But the smell always reminds me of her kitchen when I was young, before everything became complicated. What happened to her? She passed away when I was 17, he said, his voice carefully even, the way people speak when they have practiced keeping certain feelings locked away. My father wasn't the kind of man who knew how to raise a son alone, and by the time I was 20, most of the responsibilities that used to belong to him had become mine instead. Elena did not ask what those responsibilities were. She sensed the boundary in his voice, the invisible line he was drawing carefully around a part of his life he was not ready to share, and she respected it, at least for now. That's a lot for someone that young, she said instead. It was, Damien agreed, but it taught me how to survive in a world that doesn't forgive weakness easily. It also taught me how to build walls that most people never manage to get past. And yet here we are, Elena said softly. Having breakfast? Yes, he said, meeting her eyes. Here we are. Over the next hour, Elena learned small, careful pieces of the man sitting across from her. He loved old jazz records, the kind his mother used to play on quiet Sunday mornings. He had once wanted to study architecture before his life took a different path entirely. He hated cold weather but loved the ocean, and he had not taken a real vacation in almost 6 years because the responsibilities of his world did not allow for the kind of absence a vacation required. He asked about her in return, and Elena found herself opening up more than she intended, telling him about her mother's long illness, about the nursing degree she was slowly working toward while juggling shifts at the hospital, about the quiet dream she carried of one day opening a small clinic in the neighborhood where she grew up, a place where people without much money could still get proper care. You care about people you've never met, Damien said, studying her with something like admiration in his expression. That's rare. You protected a stranger running through your streets at midnight, Elena pointed out. That's rare too. That was different. Was it? He didn't answer, and this time his silence felt less like avoidance and more like genuine uncertainty, as though her question had touched something he hadn't fully examined himself. Their breakfast eventually had to end. Both of them pulled back toward the obligations waiting outside the warm little cafe by the river. But as Damien walked her back to her apartment that morning, something had clearly shifted between them. A quiet understanding neither of them spoke aloud, but both of them felt settling into place. Over the following weeks, their meetings became a careful, secret rhythm. Damien would appear outside the hospital at unpredictable hours, sometimes for a few stolen minutes, sometimes for an entire evening, when his schedule allowed. Elena learned to recognize the sound of his car before she even saw it, learned to read the small signals in his expression that told her whether he'd had a difficult day or a manageable one, learned the particular quiet that settled over him whenever his phone buzzed with a message he clearly wished he could ignore. She also began noticing things she hadn't paid attention to before, the way certain people on the street would nod respectfully toward Damien and then quickly look away, the way restaurant owners would seat them without a reservation, refusing payment no matter how firmly Damien insisted, the way his driver, a quiet, watchful man named Julian, kept scanning every street corner they passed, as though danger might appear from any direction at any moment. One evening, as they sat together on a bench overlooking the river, Elena finally asked the question she had been circling for weeks. What exactly do you do, Damien? And I don't want another careful non-answer. I want the truth. Damien was quiet for a long moment, watching the water reflect the last light of the setting sun. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and serious, stripped of the careful charm he usually wore like armor. My family controls a significant portion of business in this city, he said slowly. Some of it operates in the open, legitimate companies, properties, investments that anyone could look up and find perfectly ordinary. But underneath that there is another layer, one that involves protection, influence, and the kind of power that keeps certain parts of this city running the way they run. I inherited that responsibility from my father, and I have spent the last decade making sure no one, not rival families, not the authorities, not anyone, is able to take it away from the people who depend on me. Elena absorbed this carefully, feeling the weight of the confession settle over both of them. "So the men chasing me that first night," she said quietly. "They worked for someone who wanted to move against you." "Something like that," Damien admitted. "You walked into the middle of a situation that had nothing to do with you. And for reasons I still don't fully understand, protecting you became more important to me than staying uninvolved." "You said you had rules," Elena said. "Rules about not getting attached to anyone outside your circle." "I did," Damien said. "I do. And every single day since that night, I've been breaking them a little more." "Doesn't that put you in danger?" "It might," he admitted. "It might put you in danger too. And that thought keeps me awake more than anything else in my life ever has." Elena reached over and took his hand, surprising them both with the simple, quiet gesture. "I'm not asking you to protect me from every danger in the world, Damien. I'm asking you to be honest with me. That's all I need." "Honesty," Damien repeated softly, as though testing whether the word fit comfortably in his world. "That's not something people in my position get to offer very often." "Then maybe it's time that changed," Elena said. "At least with me." He looked at her for a long moment, something vulnerable flickering behind his composed exterior, something that looked almost like relief. "At least with you," he agreed quietly. "I think I could manage that." They sat together, as the sun disappeared completely behind the skyline, neither of them fully aware yet of how much danger their growing closeness would eventually invite into both their lives. A few nights later, Damien invited Elena to see a part of his life he had never shown anyone outside his closest circle. He brought her to a quiet property on the edge of the city, a large stone house surrounded by tall gates, and a garden that looked as though it had once been carefully tended, and was only now beginning to recover from years of neglect. "This was my mother's favorite place," Damien said, guiding Elena through the wide entrance hall. "I bought it back a few years ago, after it had passed through several owners who let it fall apart. I keep meaning to restore it properly, but I've never found the time." Elena walked slowly through the rooms, noticing faded photographs on the walls, a grand piano covered in a thin layer of dust, tall windows that let in soft evening light. "It's beautiful," she said honestly, "even like this." "My mother used to play that piano every evening," Damien said, running his fingers lightly over the closed lid. "I haven't heard anyone play it since she passed. Do you play?" "Terribly," Damien admitted, and Elena laughed, delighted by the small, human admission from a man who usually seemed to have complete control over every part of himself. "Show me," she said. He hesitated, then sat down at the bench and opened the lid, his fingers moving clumsily across the keys, producing a simple, slightly uneven melody that was far from perfect, but carried something genuine in its imperfection. Elena sat beside him, watching his concentration, seeing a version of Damien Reyes that the rest of the world never got to witness, a man who had once been a boy sitting beside his mother, learning music in a house filled with warmth instead of danger. "That was lovely," Elena said softly when he finished. "You're a terrible liar," Damien said, though he was smiling, an easy, unguarded smile that transformed his entire face. "Maybe," Elena admitted, "but I meant it anyway." They spent the rest of the evening walking through the overgrown garden, Damien pointing out which flowers his mother had planted, which paths she used to walk along in the early mornings before the rest of the household woke. Elena listened carefully, gathering these small pieces of him like precious stones, understanding slowly that beneath the composed, powerful exterior he presented to the world, there was a man still shaped by grief, still carrying the weight of a childhood cut short by responsibility. "Why are you showing me this place?" Elena finally asked, as they stood beneath an old oak tree at the edge of the property. "You could have taken me anywhere. Why here?" Damien considered the question seriously before answering. "Because this is the only place left in my life that hasn't been touched by the business," he said. "Everywhere else, every room, every meeting, every conversation, exists because of who I am in that world. But this house, this garden, this belongs to who I was before any of that started. I wanted you to see that person too, not just the man who stopped 3 strangers from hurting you on a dark street." "I already knew he existed," Elena said quietly. "I saw him the first morning we had breakfast together, when you told me about your mother's coffee." "Did you?" "I did," she said. "I think that's the version of you I've been falling for this whole time. The words hung between them in the quiet evening air, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, both aware of the significance of what had just been said aloud for the first time. Damien reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering against her cheek. "I told myself I wouldn't let this happen," he admitted quietly. "I told myself that caring about someone this deeply, in my position, was a mistake I couldn't afford to make. And now I can't imagine my life without you in it, even though every rational part of me knows exactly how dangerous that admission is." Elena leaned into his touch, feeling the weight of his words settle over her, both thrilling and frightening in equal measure. "Then let's be careful together," she said, "instead of you trying to protect me from a distance." Damien studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, a decision quietly forming. "Careful together," he repeated. "I think I could learn to do that." They stayed at the old house until well past midnight, talking about small, ordinary things that had nothing to do with danger or business, or the complicated world Damien usually lived in. For those few hours, they were simply two people falling for each other, unaware of the storm, quietly gathering just beyond the garden gates, unaware that their closeness had already been noticed by people who intended to use it as a weapon against everything Damien had built. Elena did not know yet how far those people were willing to go, or how quickly the peaceful evening beneath the old oak tree would feel like a distant memory, once the danger surrounding Damien's world finally found its way to her front door. The message arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, delivered not by phone or courier, but left directly on the front seat of Elena's car, while she was still inside the hospital finishing her shift. A single photograph, printed and folded, showing her walking hand in hand with Damien outside the old stone house, 2 nights earlier. No note, no explanation, only the photograph itself, a clear and deliberate message that someone had been watching them far more closely than either of them realized. Elena's hands trembled as she called Damien, her voice tight with a fear she had never experienced before. He arrived within 20 minutes, his expression darkening the moment he saw the photograph. "Who would do this?" Elena asked, still shaken. "I have a few guesses," Damien said grimly, studying the image carefully before folding it back up. "But I need to make some calls before I can be certain." That evening, Damien gathered his closest and most trusted people at a private office above one of his legitimate businesses, a quiet accounting firm that served as a convenient front for more sensitive conversations. Julian, his driver and longtime friend, stood near the door, arms crossed, his expression unusually tense. Beside him stood Marco Bellini, a broad-shouldered man who had worked alongside Damien's father before Damien himself took over the family's responsibilities, and a sharp, quiet woman named Isabel Grant, who managed much of the organization's more delicate negotiations. "The Castellano family has been testing our borders for months," Marco said, spreading a set of documents across the table. "Small things at first, late payments on old agreements, missed meetings, nothing that seemed worth escalating. But this photograph changes things. They're not testing our patience anymore. They're telling us they know exactly where our weakness is." "Elena isn't a weakness," Damien said sharply. "To you she's not," Isabel said carefully. "But to them, she's exactly that. A weakness they can use to pull you off balance, to distract you while they move against other parts of your operation." Damien's jaw tightened, the calm control he usually maintained visibly straining under the weight of what he was hearing. "What do they want?" "Leverage," Marco said simply. "The Castellanos have wanted a larger share of the shipping routes along the eastern docks for years. Your father never gave it to them, and neither have you. My guess is they're hoping this photograph will convince you to reconsider, quietly, before things become more complicated." "And if I refuse?" Julian finally spoke from his place near the door, his voice low and serious. "Then they'll escalate. They already know about Elena. If you refuse to negotiate, the next message might not be a photograph." Elena, who had insisted on being present for the conversation despite Damien's initial objections, felt a cold chill move through her chest at those words. "You're saying they might hurt me," she said quietly, "to get to him." No one answered immediately, which was answer enough. "That's not going to happen," Damien said firmly, turning to face her directly. "I will not let it happen." "You can't promise that, Damien," Elena said, her voice steady despite the fear underneath it. "Not against people willing to use a photograph as a threat." "I can promise I will do everything in my power to prevent it," Damien said, "and in my world, That promise carries more weight than you might realize. Over the following days, Damien's entire routine shifted around Elena's safety. Extra guards appeared near the hospital entrance, careful and unobtrusive, blending into the background so effectively that Elena barely noticed them unless she looked directly for their presence. Julian began driving her to and from every shift personally, refusing to let her walk even the short distance from the hospital doors to the car. Damien himself grew quieter, more watchful, the easy warmth she had come to know during their evenings together, replaced by a sharper, more guarded version of the man she had first met in the Docklands. "You're pulling away from me," Elena said one evening, noticing the distance in his expression as they sat together in his car outside her apartment. "I'm trying to keep you safe," Damien said. "Sometimes that means putting distance between the danger and the person I care about." "I'm not asking you to put distance between us. I'm asking you to let me understand what's happening so I can make my own choices about how much risk I'm willing to accept." Damien turned to look at her fully, something conflicted moving behind his eyes. "The risk isn't only about you understanding it, Elena. It's about what happens if my enemies decide you're valuable enough to use against me directly. It's about what happens if the next message isn't a photograph left on your car seat, but something far worse." "Then let me help you find a way through this," Elena said, instead of shutting me out. "You're not equipped for this world," Damien said, more sharply than he intended, immediately regretting the tone the moment he saw her expression shift. "I ran through your streets in the middle of the night and survived," Elena reminded him, her voice steady, despite the hurt flickering behind her eyes. "I've watched you carefully build an entire life around protecting the people who depend on you. I'm not asking to run your organization, Damien. I'm asking you to trust me enough to be honest, the way you promised you would be." Damien exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly, as he reached over and took her hand. "You're right," he admitted. "I'm sorry. Old habits make it difficult to share control over anything, especially when the stakes involve someone I care about this much. Then let's figure this out together," Elena said, "starting with why the Castellanos think a photograph will be enough to change your mind about the shipping routes." Over the following 2 weeks, Damien found himself navigating an increasingly delicate situation. Isabel arranged a private meeting with Victor Castellano, the head of the rival family, a calm and calculating man whose reputation for patience made him far more dangerous than any hot-tempered rival Damien had faced before. The meeting took place in neutral territory, a quiet restaurant that had hosted similar negotiations for decades, its owner sworn to discretion regardless of which powerful families occupied its private back room. "You've built quite a reputation for control, Damien," Victor said, studying him over a glass of red wine. "Your father was the same way. Careful, measured, never allowing personal feelings to interfere with business decisions." "I inherited more than his territory," Damien replied evenly. "I inherited his patience as well." "And yet," Victor said, a faint smile touching his lips, "you've allowed a young nurse to become important enough that a single photograph was enough to bring you to this table." "I'm here because you've been testing my borders for months," Damien said, keeping his voice carefully controlled, despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "The photograph only confirmed what I already suspected, that you're running out of patience for subtlety." Victor studied him for a long moment, clearly recalculating whatever assumptions he had walked into the meeting with. "Perhaps," he admitted, "the shipping routes have belonged to your family for 2 generations. My people believe it's time for a more balanced arrangement." "And you thought threatening someone outside this world would be an effective way to negotiate that arrangement?" "I thought," Victor said carefully, "that a man with a weakness might be more willing to compromise than a man without one. I see now that I may have misjudged how you would respond to that particular strategy." "You misjudged more than that," Damien said, his voice low and dangerous, despite its calm surface. "You misjudged how far I'm willing to go to protect the people who matter to me, and you misjudged how much patience I have left for families who mistake reasonable boundaries for weakness." The negotiation that followed was tense and carefully worded, both men aware that the wrong word or gesture could tip the fragile balance between diplomacy and open conflict. In the end, they reached a temporary agreement, a small adjustment to certain shipping allowances that gave Victor's family enough to save face without surrendering anything Damien considered essential. It was not a resolution, only a pause, but it bought Damien time time he intended to use protecting Elena more effectively than a simple negotiation ever could. When he returned to Elena that evening and explained what had happened, she listened carefully, absorbing the complicated details of a world she was only beginning to understand. "So it's over," she said hopefully. "For now." "For now," Damien agreed, though the caution in his voice told her he did not fully believe the danger had passed. Victor isn't the kind of man who accepts a temporary compromise gracefully. "This won't be the last time he tests our patience. Then we'll be ready for the next test," Elena said, surprising him with the steady determination in her voice. Together. Damien studied her for a long moment, something warm and proud moving behind his careful expression. "You continue to surprise me, Elena Marchetti." "Good," she said, allowing herself a small smile despite the exhaustion of the past 2 weeks. "I'd hate to become predictable to a man who apparently reads every situation 3 steps ahead of everyone else." Their laughter that evening felt like a small victory, a brief moment of lightness after weeks of tension and careful maneuvering. A few days later, Elena decided she wanted to understand Damien's world more fully, rather than simply waiting on the edges of it, hoping every danger would resolve itself before it reached her door. She asked Isabel if she could sit in on one of the smaller, less sensitive meetings, an invitation that surprised both Damien and his closest advisors. "Are you certain about this?" Damien asked, watching her carefully as they rode toward the office above the accounting firm. "Once you see more of how this world actually works, you can't unsee it." "I already know enough to be frightened," Elena said honestly. "I'd rather understand the shape of the danger than imagine it in the dark." Damien nodded slowly, respecting the courage behind her request, even as worry lingered in his expression. Inside the meeting, Elena watched quietly as Isabel laid out a series of financial reports, explaining how certain legitimate businesses served as careful cover for less visible operations, how loyalty among the organization's members was maintained through a careful balance of respect, obligation, and occasional reminders of consequence. Marco spoke about territory disputes with other families across the city, explaining the delicate web of alliances and rivalries that kept the entire system from collapsing into open conflict. What struck Elena most was not the danger itself, but the discipline. Every decision seemed to be weighed carefully, every risk measured against potential consequence, every relationship maintained through patient, deliberate effort. Damien ran his organization the way a skilled physician might manage a complicated illness, not through brute force alone, but through careful diagnosis, steady hands, and constant vigilance. "You're quiet," Damien observed as they left the meeting later that afternoon. "I expected something louder," Elena admitted. "More frightening somehow. Instead, it felt almost like watching people manage a hospital during a difficult shift. Constant problems, constant pressure, but everyone moving with purpose instead of panic." "That's a generous comparison," Damien said, though he looked pleased by it. "Maybe," Elena said, "but it helps me understand why people trust you enough to follow you, even when the stakes are this high." Their relationship deepened in the weeks that followed, strengthened rather than weakened by Elena's growing understanding of the world Damien occupied. She began recognizing the quiet signals among his closest people, learned which subtle shifts in tone signaled trouble brewing before anyone spoke a word about it directly, learned to read the tension in Julian's shoulders whenever a delivery arrived unannounced. It was during this period that Elena first noticed something unusual about Nathan Cole, one of Damien's senior lieutenants, a man who had worked closely with the organization for nearly 8 years and had always presented himself as fiercely loyal. Nothing about his behavior seemed overtly suspicious at first, only small inconsistencies that Elena noticed, simply because she was paying closer attention than most people around her. Nathan seemed to know details about Damien's schedule that he shouldn't have had access to. He asked careful, probing questions about Elena's routine during casual conversation, questions that felt slightly too specific to be simple curiosity. He grew unusually tense whenever Victor Castellano's name came up in conversation, a tension that seemed different from the wary respect everyone else in the organization showed toward a dangerous rival. Elena mentioned her observations to Damien one evening, careful not to sound accusatory about a man Damien had trusted for nearly a decade. "Nathan has been with the organization since before I took over from my father," Damien said, though there was a flicker of consideration behind his initial dismissal. "He's proven his loyalty many times over." "I'm not saying he isn't loyal," Elena said carefully. "I'm saying something feels different about him lately. And I've learned to trust instincts like that during long hospital shifts, when small details sometimes matter more than anyone expects. Damien considered her words seriously, the trust between them having grown strong enough that he no longer dismissed her observations simply because they came from someone outside his usual circle of advisors. "I'll have Isabel look into it quietly," he said finally. "If there's nothing to find, no harm done. But if your instincts are right, I'd rather know now than discover it too late." Isabel's investigation moved carefully and quietly over the following 2 weeks, careful not to alert Nathan that anyone suspected him of anything unusual. What she found confirmed Elena's instincts far more thoroughly than anyone expected. Nathan had been meeting privately with a representative from the Castellano family for nearly 3 months, exchanging information in small, careful increments that had allowed Victor's people to anticipate several of Damien's decisions before they were officially announced. The photograph left on Elena's car, the one that had started the entire tense negotiation with Victor Castellano, had come directly from Nathan, who had been quietly documenting the growing relationship between Damien and Elena for weeks before finally deciding the information was valuable enough to share with the rival family. "He sold us out," Marco said grimly, when Isabel finally presented her findings to Damien's inner circle. "Nearly a decade of trust, and he sold every bit of it to the Castellanos." "Why?" Damien asked, his voice tight with a controlled anger that Elena had never witnessed from him before. What could they possibly have offered him that was worth this kind of betrayal? "Money, mostly," Isabel said, along with a promise of a larger role within their organization once the shipping route negotiations concluded in their favor. It seems Nathan felt he had been passed over for advancement here one too many times. Damien sat in heavy silence for several long moments, absorbing the full weight of the betrayal. Elena watched him carefully, seeing the toll this discovery took on a man who prided himself on understanding the loyalties and motivations of everyone around him. "What happens now?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. "Now," Damien said, his voice quiet but resolute, "we decide how to respond to a man who has been feeding our enemies information for months, information that has already put you in danger once, and could easily put you in far greater danger before this is finished." The weight of that statement hung heavily in the room, and Elena understood, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity, exactly how dangerous the coming days were likely to become. Damien called a private meeting the following evening, gathering only his most trusted people in the quiet upstairs office, deliberately excluding Nathan from the invitation to avoid raising suspicion before they had decided how best to handle the situation. Julian stood near the window, arms crossed, his expression darker than Elena had ever seen it. Marco paced slowly along the far wall, clearly struggling to reconcile nearly a decade of trust with the betrayal Isabel's investigation had uncovered. "We can't simply confront him," Isabel said carefully. "If Nathan realizes we know, he'll either run or warn Victor immediately, and either outcome puts us in a worse position than we're in now." "Then what do you suggest?" Damien asked, his voice controlled but carrying an unmistakable edge of anger beneath its calm surface. "We use his betrayal against him," Isabel said. "Feed him false information, let him pass it along to Victor, and use whatever Victor does in response to understand exactly how deep this partnership goes, and what Victor actually intends to do with the shipping routes once he believes he has the upper hand." Damien considered the plan carefully, weighing the risk against the potential advantage. "And if Victor decides to act on the false information before we're ready? Then we'll know sooner, rather than later, exactly how dangerous this situation has become," Marco said grimly. "Better to draw that danger into the open on our terms than wait for it to arrive unannounced." Elena listened to the careful strategy forming around her, feeling a growing unease she couldn't quite name. "What happens to Nathan once this is finished?" she finally asked. The room fell silent, and Elena realized the question carried more weight than she initially understood, touching on consequences she wasn't fully prepared to witness. "That depends on how deep his betrayal actually runs," Damien said quietly, "and on what Victor intends to do with the trust Nathan has been selling him." Over the following days, Isabel carefully fed Nathan a piece of false information, a supposed change to the timing of an upcoming shipment along the eastern docks, information that would be valuable to Victor Castellano if he intended to intercept it, and completely useless if he had no such plans. Nathan took the bait almost immediately. requesting an unscheduled meeting with his contact within the Castellano organization, less than 2 days after receiving the information. Julian followed him quietly to the meeting, careful and unseen, gathering photographs and recordings that confirmed everything Isabel's investigation had already suspected. Nathan met openly with Victor's representative, exchanging documents, discussing details about Damien's operations with a casual familiarity that made it clear this had been happening regularly for months. But what Julian discovered next was far more alarming than simple corporate espionage. Nathan wasn't only selling information about shipping routes and business decisions. He had also been providing detailed reports about Elena's daily routine, her schedule at the hospital, the streets she walked, the times she was most likely to be alone and vulnerable. "They're planning something involving Elena directly," Julian reported grimly, once he returned to deliver his findings. "Victor isn't satisfied with the small concessions from the last negotiation. He's planning to use her as more direct leverage." Damien's expression turned cold in a way Elena had never witnessed before. Every trace of the warm, careful man she had grown to love, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. "When?" he demanded. "Soon," Julian said. "Within the week, based on what I overheard." The following hours passed in a tense blur of careful planning. Damien moved Elena immediately to the old stone house on the edge of the city, surrounding the property with additional security, refusing to let her return to her apartment or her hospital shifts until the immediate danger had passed. "You're putting your entire life on hold," Elena said, watching him coordinate with his people late into the night, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "You are my life," Damien said simply, without hesitation. "There's no version of this where I choose anything else over keeping you safe." Elena felt the weight of his words settle over her, both comforting and terrifying in their intensity. "What about Nathan?" she asked quietly. "What happens to him now?" Damien was silent for a long moment before answering. "Nathan made his choice when he decided your safety was worth less than his own ambition," he said finally. "I intend to make sure he understands the full consequence of that choice." The confrontation, when it finally came, happened 3 days later, in the same upstairs office, where Nathan had sat through countless meetings over the past decade, believing his betrayal remained hidden. Damien assembled his full inner circle, along with undeniable evidence of Nathan's dealings with the Castellano family, evidence that included recorded conversations, photographs, and financial records tracing the payments Nathan had received in exchange for his information. Nathan's confident expression crumbled the moment he understood the extent of what Damien's people had uncovered. "Damien, I can explain. You sold information that put Elena directly in danger," Damien said, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable authority that silenced any attempt at further excuse. "You've spent months undermining an organization that trusted you, feeding our enemies information that could have gotten people I care about seriously hurt." "I never meant for it to go that far," Nathan said, his voice tight with genuine fear now. "Victor promised me a position within his organization, more respect than I've ever received here. You didn't think about the consequences of your choices," Damien finished for him. "That's precisely the problem." What followed was not the violent confrontation Elena had feared during the tense days leading up to this moment, but something far more calculated. Damien, with the careful counsel of Isabel and Marco, made the decision to remove Nathan permanently from any position of trust within the organization, stripping him of the resources and connections that had made him valuable to Victor Castellano in the first place. Nathan was given a clear, final warning that any further contact with the Castellano family, or any attempt to harm Elena or anyone connected to Damien's organization, would result in consequences far more severe than the loss of his position. It was not mercy exactly, but it was restraint, a deliberate choice on Damien's part to handle the betrayal with the same careful discipline that governed every other decision within his organization, rather than allowing personal anger to dictate a response that might spiral into something neither of them could control. News of Nathan's removal spread quickly through the organization, and more slowly, deliberately, back to Victor Castellano himself, along with a clear message that Damien's people were fully aware of the plan targeting Elena, and that any further attempt to use her as leverage would be met with consequences that would make the current tension look mild by comparison. Victor, recognizing that his strategy had been thoroughly exposed and neutralized, chose caution over escalation, at least for the time being. The immediate danger to Elena eased, though the underlying tension between the two families remained. A fragile peace built on mutual understanding, rather than genuine trust. In the aftermath, Elena found herself reflecting on everything the past weeks had revealed about the man she had fallen for. Damien had shown her both the warmth hidden beneath his careful exterior and the steel that made him capable of running an organization built on danger and discipline. She had watched him choose restraint over rage, careful strategy over impulsive anger, even when the person he loved had been directly threatened. "You could have handled that differently," Elena said one evening, as they finally returned to the quiet stone house that had become something like a sanctuary for both of them during the crisis. More harshly, "I could have," Damien agreed, "but that's not the kind of man I want to be, especially not with you watching." "Is that why you chose restraint? Because I was watching?" Damien considered the question carefully before answering. "Partly," he admitted, "but mostly because I've learned that the kind of power built on fear alone never lasts. My father understood that, even if he struggled to balance it with everything else his position demanded. I'd like to think I've learned that lesson a little better than he did." Elena reached for his hand, feeling the exhaustion of the past week finally begin to ease. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I think you're becoming exactly the kind of man your mother would have been proud of." Damien's expression softened at the mention of his mother, a rare vulnerability crossing his features. "That means more to me than you probably realize," he said quietly. They sat together in comfortable silence as the evening settled around them, both of them aware that the danger surrounding their relationship had not disappeared entirely, only retreated temporarily into the shadows. But the peace did not last as long as either of them hoped. 10 days after Nathan's removal, Isabel arrived at the stone house early one morning, her usually composed expression carrying an urgency that immediately put everyone on alert. "Nathan is gone," she said without preamble. "His apartment is empty. No forwarding address, no contact with anyone who used to know him. He disappeared sometime in the last 2 days. You think he's gone to Victor directly," Damien said, already moving toward his coat. "I think it's worse than that," Isabel said. "One of our contacts along the docks mentioned seeing him meeting with people who don't belong to the Castellano family at all. A newer group, smaller, more aggressive, looking to establish territory by proving they can successfully challenge an established name like yours. He's selling us to someone even more dangerous than Victor," Marco said grimly, arriving just in time to hear the end of the conversation. Elena felt the familiar cold weight of fear settle back into her chest, the fragile peace of the past week shattering instantly. "What does that mean for us?" she asked quietly. "It means Nathan is no longer simply a disgruntled employee looking for a better position," Damien said, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "It means he's actively trying to destroy everything I've built, and he's willing to align himself with anyone who will help him do it, regardless of the danger that brings to everyone around me." The following days passed in careful, tense preparation. Damien's organization moved with quiet efficiency, tightening security around every vulnerable point, reaching out to allies who owed favors, gathering information about this new, unknown group that Nathan had apparently aligned himself with. Elena remained at the stone house, restless and increasingly frustrated by her enforced isolation from the world she had built for herself, the hospital shifts she missed, the small daily routines that had once felt so ordinary and now felt impossibly far away. "I can't keep hiding here indefinitely," she said one evening, watching Damien review reports at the kitchen table, exhaustion visible in every line of his posture. "My patients need me. My life needs to continue, even with all of this happening around us." "I know," Damien said, rubbing his eyes tiredly. "I just need a little more time to understand exactly what we're facing before I can let you go back to your normal routine." "And if this new group is patient enough to wait you out?" Elena asked. "If they're willing to spend months gathering information the way Nathan did, are you going to keep me locked away here indefinitely?" Damien didn't have an easy answer, and the silence between them stretched uncomfortably before he finally spoke. "No," he admitted. "That's not fair to you, and it's not who I want to be, keeping you isolated out of fear, rather than trusting you to make informed decisions about your own safety." They reached a careful compromise. Elena would return to limited shifts at the hospital, always accompanied by Julian or another trusted member of Damien's security, her schedule deliberately randomized to make her movements harder to predict. It was not a perfect solution, but it allowed her to reclaim some piece of the normal life she feared losing, entirely to the danger surrounding Damien's world. The breakthrough in understanding the new threat came nearly 2 weeks later, when Isabel finally identified the group Nathan had aligned himself with, a smaller, ambitious organization led by a calculating man named Adrian Voss, who had spent the past several years quietly building influence along the city's northern edge, waiting for the right opportunity to challenge one of the established families directly. Voss doesn't want a simple negotiation like Victor did, Isabel explained, laying out everything they had gathered during a tense meeting at the accounting firm's private office. He wants to make an example. Taking territory from an organization as established as yours would establish his reputation instantly, make every other family in the city take him seriously overnight. And Nathan is helping him do that, Damien said grimly. Nathan is giving him a roadmap, Isabel confirmed. Every vulnerability, every weak point, every piece of information about your operations that he gathered over nearly a decade of trusted service. The threat crystallized fully 3 days later, when Julian intercepted a message intended for one of Voss's people, detailing a planned confrontation at one of Damien's key properties along the eastern docks, the same shipping route that had caused the initial tension with Victor Castellano months earlier. The plan was audacious, an attempt to seize control of the route directly, using enough force to make it clear that Damien's organization could no longer guarantee the safety of anyone who continued working with them. If Voss succeeds here, even partially, it sends a message to every family in this city, Marco said, studying the intercepted plans with a grim expression. It tells them Damien Reyes can be challenged and beaten. Then we make sure he isn't, Damien said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority Elena had witnessed the very first night they met, when he had stopped 3 dangerous men with nothing more than his reputation and his composed refusal to back down. The days leading up to the confrontation at the docks were the tensest Elena had experienced since meeting Damien. She watched him transform in front of her, the warm, careful man who played clumsy piano melodies and spoke softly about his mother's garden, replaced by someone entirely focused on protecting everything he had built, someone whose calm exterior now hid a fierce, calculated determination. "I need you somewhere safe when this happens," Damien told her, the night before the planned confrontation, his hands resting gently on her shoulders as he studied her face carefully. "Somewhere Voss's people have no way of finding or reaching you." "Where?" Elena asked, though she already suspected she wasn't going to like the answer. "Isabel has a property outside the city, secure and completely disconnected from anything related to my operations. Julian will take you there tonight, and he'll stay with you until I can confirm the situation at the docks has been resolved." Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist on staying close enough to know immediately what was happening, but she understood, perhaps better than she wanted to admit, that her presence anywhere near the confrontation would only give Damien one more thing to worry about during a moment that demanded his complete focus. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said instead, her voice steady, despite the fear tightening in her chest. "I promise," Damien said, pulling her close. "I have far too much to come back to now, to take unnecessary risks." The confrontation at the docks unfolded over the following 2 days with a careful, calculated precision that reflected everything Damien had learned about managing his organization's dangerous world. Rather than meeting Voss's aggressive plan with equal aggression, Damien's people worked quietly to expose the confrontation before it could fully unfold, alerting the other established families across the city to Voss's ambitious plan and framing it as a direct threat to the careful balance that had kept the entire city's underground operations from spiraling into open, destructive conflict. Faced with unified opposition from multiple established families, rather than the isolated challenge he had hoped for, Voss's ambitious plan collapsed before it could fully materialize. His forces, expecting to face only Damien's people, found themselves instead confronting a coordinated response from several powerful organizations, all of whom understood that allowing an ambitious newcomer to successfully challenge an established territory would invite chaos that threatened everyone's carefully maintained interests. Nathan, whose information had been the foundation of Voss's entire plan, disappeared from the city entirely once it became clear his gamble had failed catastrophically, leaving behind nothing but a trail of broken trust and the quiet understanding among everyone involved that his name would never again carry weight in any organization within the city. When Damien finally returned to the safe house where Elena had been waiting anxiously for 2 days, exhausted but unharmed, she ran to him without hesitation, relief flooding through her entire body. "It's over," Damien said quietly, holding her close. "For now, at least. Voss has retreated, Nathan is gone, and the other families understand clearly that challenging my territory carries consequences far greater than they anticipated." "For now," Elena repeated softly, understanding that in Damien's world, peace was rarely permanent, only a careful pause between one challenge and the next. "For now," Damien agreed, "but I intend to make the most of every peaceful moment we're given, starting with this one." They stood together in the quiet doorway of the safe house, both of them changed by everything the past weeks had demanded of them, each of them stronger for having survived a test of loyalty, trust, and the careful, dangerous balance required to build a life within Damien Reyes's complicated world. 3 months passed after the confrontation at the docks, and the city gradually settled into a new, more stable rhythm. Word had spread quickly through every family and organization that Damien Reyes had not only survived a coordinated challenge to his territory, but had done so through careful strategy, rather than unnecessary conflict, earning him a level of respect that went beyond simple fear. Victor Castellano, having witnessed how decisively Damien had handled the threat from Voss, quietly abandoned any further ambitions toward the eastern shipping routes, choosing instead to maintain the careful, respectful distance that had defined relations between their families for years before Nathan's betrayal disrupted the balance. For Elena, the months brought a slow, steady return to normalcy, though it was a different normalcy than the one she had known before that first frightening night in the docklands. She returned fully to her hospital shifts, though Julian or another trusted member of Damien's security remained a quiet, familiar presence nearby, a precaution that had become simply part of her routine rather than a source of constant anxiety. She continued working toward her nursing degree, spending long evenings studying at the kitchen table of the small apartment she had once considered giving up entirely during the most dangerous weeks of the crisis. Damien, too, had changed in ways that became increasingly apparent as the months passed. He spent more time at the old stone house, slowly restoring the garden his mother had once tended so carefully, learning to play the piano with a little less clumsiness each time Elena convinced him to sit down at the bench. He began delegating more responsibility to Isabel and Marco, trusting them with decisions he once would have insisted on handling personally, creating space in his own life that had never existed before Elena walked into it. "You're different," Elena observed one evening, watching him work carefully in the garden, restoring a section of flower beds that had been neglected for years before he purchased the property. "Different how?" Damien asked, not looking up from his work. "Lighter," Elena said, settling onto the grass beside him, "like you've finally given yourself permission to want something outside of your responsibilities." Damien sat back on his heels, considering her words seriously. "I think that's exactly what happened," he admitted. "For years, I believed the only way to protect everyone who depended on me was to eliminate every personal vulnerability, every attachment that could be used against me. I thought strength meant having nothing left to lose. And now I understand that having something worth protecting, worth fighting for, doesn't make a man weaker," Damien said, reaching for her hand. "It makes him more determined than he ever was before. I run this organization more carefully now, not less, because I finally understand exactly what failure would cost me." Elena smiled, leaning against his shoulder as the evening light spread gold across the garden they had slowly brought back to life together. "Your mother would be proud of what you've built here," she said softly. "Both this garden and everything else." "I like to think so," Damien said, "though I suspect she'd have opinions about how long it took me to figure out what actually mattered." Their relationship had settled into something neither of them had expected during those first tense weeks of danger and uncertainty, a genuine partnership built on hard-won trust rather than simple attraction or convenience. Elena had earned a place within Damien's world that few outsiders ever achieved, not through any formal role within his organization, but through the quiet respect she had built among Isabel, Marco, and Julian during the crisis, each of them recognizing the steady courage she had shown throughout months of danger that would have driven most people away entirely. "I've been thinking about something," Damien said one evening, several weeks later, as they sat together on the same bench overlooking the river where they had first admitted their feelings for each other months earlier. "That sounds serious," Elena said, studying his expression carefully. "It is," Damien admitted, reaching into his jacket pocket. "I've spent most of my adult life believing that everything important in my world had to remain separate from anything personal, anything vulnerable. You've spent the past several months proving to me exactly how wrong that belief was." He opened his hand to reveal a small, elegant ring, simple but clearly chosen with careful thought. Elena's breath caught, her heart racing as she looked between the ring and Damien's carefully composed expression, which barely concealed the nervousness underneath. "I'm not asking you to become part of a world I know frightens you," Damien said quietly. "I'm asking you to help me build something new within it, something that belongs to both of us, shaped as much by your courage and your compassion as by anything I inherited from my father. I want to build a life where the rules I follow are ones we create together, not ones forced on me by fear or tradition." Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice, by everything they had survived together to reach this moment. "Damien Reyes," she said softly, "I never imagined my life would look anything like this when I took that shortcut through the Docklands all those months ago." "Neither did I," Damien admitted, a rare, unguarded smile spreading across his face. "But I've never been more certain of anything than I am of wanting you beside me for whatever comes next." "Yes," Elena said, her voice breaking with emotion as she extended her hand toward him. "Yes, I'll build this life with you." The following months brought careful, deliberate changes to Damien's organization, changes that reflected the new balance he had found in his personal life. He restructured certain aspects of his operations, reducing unnecessary risks, strengthening alliances with families who valued stability over aggressive expansion, and building a foundation that no longer depended solely on fear to maintain order. Isabel took on greater responsibility within the organization's daily operations, her careful, strategic mind proving invaluable as Damien deliberately created more balance between his professional obligations and the life he was building with Elena. Elena, for her part, began quietly using her position to advocate for something she had dreamed about long before she ever met Damien Reyes. With careful support from Damien's resources, though always maintaining strict separation from anything connected to the less visible parts of his organization, she began laying the groundwork for the small community clinic she had once described to him during their very first breakfast together by the river. It became a shared project between them, something built entirely outside the shadow of danger and negotiation that had defined so much of their relationship's early months, a symbol of the new life they were carefully constructing together. On the evening of their wedding, held in the garden of the old stone house beneath the same oak tree where Damien had first admitted how deeply he had fallen for her, Elena stood beside him, surrounded by the small, careful circle of people who had helped them survive everything the past year had demanded of them. Isabel stood as her witness, Marco and Julian standing solemnly nearby, each of them having become as much a part of Elena's life as they had always been part of Damien's. "I once told you I had rules I never broke," Damien said quietly during his vows, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly moving beneath the surface. "Rules about attachment, about vulnerability, about never allowing anyone close enough to become a weakness my enemies could exploit. I broke every one of those rules the moment I met you, and it remains the single best decision I have ever made." "You didn't just break your rules," Elena replied, her own voice thick with emotion, as she looked into the eyes of the man who had once frightened 3 strangers into silence, with nothing more than a calm, steady presence. "You built new ones, better ones, rules built on trust instead of fear, on partnership instead of isolation. I'm honored to help you keep building them, for the rest of our lives." As the sun set behind the garden that evening, casting the same warm golden light that had first drawn Elena to notice the quiet vulnerability hidden beneath Damien's powerful exterior, both of them understood that whatever challenges still waited ahead in the complicated world they now shared, they would face every one of them together, bound not by the old rules that had once defined Damien's carefully guarded existence, but by a new understanding they had built together, one choice, one honest conversation, and one quiet act of courage at a time. A year after the wedding, the small community clinic Elena had once described so hopefully during their very first breakfast together, finally opened its doors along the same neighborhood street where she had grown up. Damien stood quietly at the back of the small gathering during the opening ceremony, watching Elena greet the first patients with the same warmth and dedication that had first drawn him to her on that chaotic night in the Docklands. It was, in many ways, the truest reflection of everything they had built together, a place created not from fear or obligation, but from genuine care, existing entirely outside the shadow of the dangerous world Damien still carefully managed every day. "You look proud," Isabel observed, standing beside him as they watched the clinic fill with its first patients. "I am," Damien admitted, "prouder of this than almost anything I've built in my entire career." "It suits you," Isabel said, a rare smile crossing her usually composed features. "Being someone people admire, instead of someone they simply fear." "I still need people to fear me occasionally," Damien said, a hint of dry humor in his voice. "It's remarkably useful in certain negotiations." "Of course," Isabel agreed, "but it's different now. There's a difference between fear and respect, and I think you've finally found the balance between them." Damien considered her words carefully, watching Elena laugh warmly with an elderly patient across the room. "I think Elena taught me that balance," he said quietly. "I'm not certain I would have found it on my own." Life within Damien's world continued to demand careful attention, of course. Rival families still occasionally tested boundaries, business rivals still occasionally required careful negotiation, and the responsibilities of running an organization built on decades of complicated history never fully disappeared. But Damien approached each challenge differently now, with the steady patience of a man who understood exactly what he stood to lose, and exactly what he intended to protect. Nathan's name occasionally surfaced in careful conversations among Damien's allies, rumors of a man drifting between smaller, less established organizations across different cities, never quite finding the position of respect he had once betrayed everything to obtain. Damien felt no satisfaction in these updates, only a quiet, settled understanding that some choices carried consequences that outlasted the immediate danger they created, consequences that Nathan would likely carry for the rest of his life. Victor Castellano, in the years that followed, became an unlikely ally rather than a persistent threat, the careful respect earned during their tense negotiations, gradually evolving into genuine cooperation between their two families. He even attended a fundraising event Elena organized for the clinic 2 years after its opening, standing quietly near the back of the room, offering a generous donation with the simple observation that a man who could build something as genuinely good as this clinic deserved every bit of the respect his reputation commanded throughout the city. Marco eventually stepped back from the more demanding aspects of daily operations, choosing to mentor a new generation within the organization, rather than continuing the exhausting pace he had maintained since Damien's father first built the foundation of their family's influence. Julian remained close to both Damien and Elena, evolving from a careful driver and bodyguard into something closer to family, a constant, steady presence through every celebration and challenge that followed their wedding. Elena, meanwhile, found herself navigating an identity that would have seemed impossible during those first frightened weeks after running through Damien's territory in the dark. She was no longer simply the nurse who had stumbled into a dangerous world by accident, nor was she someone who had abandoned her own life entirely to become part of Damien's. Instead, she had built something uniquely her own, a respected clinic serving the community she had grown up in, a marriage built on genuine partnership rather than convenience or fear, and a quiet but undeniable influence within Damien's world that came not from any formal position, but from the respect she had earned through her own courage and compassion. On quiet evenings, when the demands of both the clinic and Damien's organization finally allowed them a few uninterrupted hours together, they often returned to the garden beneath the old oak tree, the same place where Damien had first admitted how completely he had fallen for her, despite every rule he had once sworn to protect. The garden had fully recovered by then, flowers blooming in careful rows that mirrored the photographs Damien's mother had left behind decades earlier, a living reminder of everything they had rebuilt together from the fragile beginnings of that first, frightening night in the Docklands. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked one such evening, resting her head against his shoulder as the sun began its slow descent behind the garden walls. "Breaking every rule you swore you'd never break?" Damien considered the question with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to every important decision in his life, then shook his head slowly, certain of his answer. "Not for a single moment," he said. "Those rules kept me safe for a long time, but they also kept me alone. You taught me that safety built on isolation isn't really safety at all, just a slower, quieter kind of loss." And now, Damien said, pulling her closer as the golden evening light settled over them both. I've built something far more valuable than any rule ever protected. A life worth every risk it took to build it. The mafia boss who had once believed strength required isolation had discovered, through Elena, a different kind of strength entirely. One rooted not in the absence of vulnerability, but in the courage to embrace it fully, and to build something worth protecting, beyond the boundaries of fear that had once defined every rule he lived by.